There's an even harder question, though, that this suggests, and it has to do with the transnational dimension of equality and inequality, about which you've written. What might that look like? And is it possible to create forms of allegiance and belonging beyond the nation state?
Yeah, no. So I stand for democratic socialism, federal socialism. I would like some United States of the world with progressive taxation. This will take a lot of time, but before that, I think we need to rebuild some new form of internationalism. So you can you start by I say accumulating wealth in the US, in France, in Germany by using all the public infrastructure, and then you acquire the right to press a button and transfer this wealth to another jurisdiction with no possibility to follow you, to tax you, and then you tell the citizenry, that's too bad, we don't know where the wealth has gone, there's nothing we can do. Except that you have built this incredibly sophisticated international legal system which allows you to press on this button and transfer the wealth. So here there's a level of hypocrisy. I mean, you start to build an international legal system that is made to basically for the richest to escape completely their common duties, and then you pretend that this is natural, and so that's the worst thing you can do to ideas of internationalism, because this is the worst recipe to make people hate internationalism. So we have to realize that you cannot just blame the right-wing populists in that case. You cannot just blame them, blame their voters, blame their deplorable voters, deplorable leaders, etc. And I think the left party, the center-left party in power, have to blame themselves and to realize that the way they have built internationalism and globalization has been a machinery to make normal people hate this. I think if we don't do something like that, where we can control capital flows, trade flows, is that we give the floor to the nativists who are going to control labor flows, identity, people, and this will be ugly. And there's a real risk. The so-called progressive, who like to describe themselves as progressive, in fact, put themselves more and more in the situation of defending the winners of globalization. Mm-hmm. And then when this will be really a new entrenched reality, it will be, very difficult to change from this. And so, yes, internationalism has to be rebuilt, and this will have to come by, questioning the very foundation of the kind of free trade and free capital flow regimes that were developed, 30 or 40 years ago. I hope, the movement comes in a sort of peaceful manner through democratic mobilization. It can also come through enormous pressure coming from the South, because I think, the big, the elephant of the room here is that the rise of unregulated free trade and Western enrichment has come with a dramatic decline of planetary habitability, and which, is firstly targeting countries in the global South.
I wonder if we can discuss how this approach would apply to the debate about dealing with climate change. It's very difficult, as we've seen, to get countries of the world to agree on their responsibility for reducing carbon emission. That Western countries, and especially the United States, has pushed for in global climate agreements is to allow for tradable carbon emission credits, so that countries say they are willing to accept more demanding commitments for reducing emissions if they are allowed to meet those targets not only by reducing their own emissions, but by paying some other country to reduce their emissions and to get credit for it. What do you think about that?
Well, if this is an excuse for the US to not reduce their carbon emissions, and then, I think this, not only this is not acceptable, but I think at some point the rest of the there's going to be a big backlash in the rest of the world. It's going to, at some point, if you look at the cumulated carbon emission, of the US and Western Europe over the past 200 years, as compared to their share of these two regions in world population, they have 60-70% of cumulated emission for less than 20% of the population. If you add Russia and China, you get 80-90% of cumulated emission for less than a third of total population. At some point, this is going to create a lot of backlash. So there needs to be a huge reduction of emission in the US and in Europe, which has started a little bit, but starting from levels which are so incredibly high per capita terms, that, of course, sometimes say, oh, look, but at China now the total emissions are very large. Okay, but you have more than 1 billion people, So what's the solution? I think it's one of the big battles we have between the nationalist ideology, socialist ideology, liberal ideology, which I described earlier, is that the nationalists like Trump or Le Pen are going to make more and more strongly the case, okay, you want to make us pay instead of China, instead of India, and, we don't want to pay. And so here the thing is that if you raise issues in terms of country-to-country redistribution, so, the US as a rule have to pay, France as a rule has to pay, this is a dead end. Because indeed the nationalists are going to want the day, because, it's people, many people in the US, many people in France, in Europe are going to say, well, look, I'm not so rich. Why should I pay? There are lots of very rich people in China. Why should I pay instead of them? That's not going to work. So this is why we have to move from a sort of territorial representation of the conflict to something closer to a class conflict, where basically we want billionaires, large multinational, to pay, whether they are in the US, in China, in Europe. So I think this has to be, sort of targeted, specified fraction of a tax rate over top billionaires, over multinational, which goes directly to countries in the south, and in particular countries that are most exposed to climate change. So the only way to make this acceptable to public opinion in the US, in France, is to target specifically, high wealth, large corporations that will pay directly. Short of that, this is not going to work.
Let me test your international socialist principles with a question about borders. Is there any good principled reason not to have open borders?
I think the free circulation always has to come with some specific public good that needs to be financed, whether it is education, transportation, environment. So to take an example, in Europe, European Union member states have decided that you are free as a student, for instance, to go in any country you want to study. I think it's a fantastic principle, one of the great achievements of European Union. The only problem is that we didn't plan anything to pay for this university funding. This illustrates, the general answer I want to make is, if we plan sufficiently well, the funding of the public services, whether it is university, hospital, housing, transportation, infrastructure, if we plan sufficiently well all of this, I don't see any reason to have sort of some deep restriction to free circulation. But of course, that's a big if.
So at the moment, do rich countries have a right to keep out migrants from poor countries who want to come?
I mean, what do you mean by a right? I think we all have a right to think of a better system. We all have a duty to think of a better set of institutions. And so, if you're asking me, is Europe right now sufficiently open to the rest of the world in terms of migrant flows, my answer is no. If you're asking me, is this the best solution? No, this is not the best solution. We've never been as rich as we are today, so of course we could do much better than that. But I think this is yet an example where, because we've given up on social justice, because we've given up on some ambitious continuation of the egalitarian agenda, basically by making the most powerful economic actors accountable to democratic control and to contribution to the public goods we need to pay. You have this nativist discourse sort of blaming migrants or blaming supposedly excessively open frontiers for our problems.
Right.
Whereas in fact, this is the magnitude of the flow, as compared to the 500 million population of Europe, is in fact relatively small if you actually look at the numbers.
The reason I'm pressing you on this, Thomas, is it seems to me that one of the greatest political vulnerabilities of left parties and left politics is that they have allowed the right to lay claim to some of the most potent sources of politics, namely patriotism, community, belonging. The immigration issue is an issue that forces us to ask questions about the moral significance of national borders and therefore, by implication, the moral significance of national communities as communities of mutual dependence and mutual responsibility. I think it's a mistake to cede patriotism to parties of the right. It seems to me that social democratic and progressive parties should articulate their own conception of what patriotism and belonging mean, and perhaps extending it to requiring a certain kind of economic patriotism of companies that would seek tax havens rather than contribute to the common good in the countries where they made their profits. That could be construed as an obligation of companies under the heading of a kind of economic patriotism. Why is it, do you think, if you agree, that parties of the left have had a hard time, especially in recent decades, articulating an ethic of membership, belonging, community, shared identity of a kind that would be necessary to provide sources of meaning and identity that the right wing seems to tap into, but also that would be necessary to support the more ambitious progressive tax system and welfare state that social democrats and democratic socialists care about?
So first, I think what's explaining the vote for Trump or the vote for Le Pen is primarily, if you really look at the specific places where Trump is getting a lot of vote or Le Pen is getting a lot of vote, this is primarily going to be explained by the job loss, in particular in manufacturing, due to trade competition, rather than an inflow of migrants. And I think it's very important to see that. So if you try to explain the places where you have a very high Trump vote or very high Le Pen vote by using, the inflow of migrants, you explain very little.
Well,
but what you but there's another. No, but there's
the
another
issue, the salience of the immigration issue is very high in places with next to no immigrants.
But where you explain
why is that?
a lot.
Why is that?
No, but where you explain a lot, it's not as if there was no observable event that explains anything.
Yes.
There's another observable event which explains a lot, which is the destruction of jobs.
Yes, okay.
But let's address this.
Yes.
But no,
yes,
look, yes.
Of course.
No, but that's so. You're asking me why is it that the left has not been able to respond to that? Well, because they've not addressed this, and as long as they don't address, the trade and the job issue.
Yes.
They will be. They will not. It's not by competing with the nationalist right on the identity discourse and the migrant discourse that they will win election, because the nationalist right will always be more convincing that they are on this front. What's important, I think, is to address what's really the core of the vote. For the US, it's very clear that the counties where Trump has been getting the most votes, the big predictor is the job destruction due to manufacturing. This is not, the inflow of migrants from Muslim countries or whatever.
Sure,
this is just wrong.
I understand.
So I think these issues of, job loss, trade competition, transportation, housing, are the concrete issues that have led to this feeling of being abandoned by actually both the center-right and the center-left, much more than issues of identity. And to summarize, I think the problem of the left is that not only they have not questioned the way economic globalization have been organized, but they have been the champion, as you've yourself very well shown, of this evolution. Because as long as the left will only say, okay, we are waiting for some international agreement on common taxation, on carbon taxation, on everything, then, basically you're telling your public opinion, there's nothing we can do without others agreeing. Yeah. The only thing we can do is to control our borders with respect to migrants and identity. Now, if you tell that to your public opinion during many decades, you should not be surprised that at the end of the day, the entire political discussion is about border control and identity, because you sort of pretend that this is the only thing that you control. So I think, that's a trap. That's something that should be avoided at all costs. Because in the end, this will be the victory of the nationalist side.
I think there may be a nuance of difference here that, let me see if I can try to describe it, and you'll tell me if you recognize it. Identity, I think I would distinguish less sharply, Thomas, than you, between identity and economic effects. Of course, I agree that the job losses due to the trade policies of the age of hyperglobalization have had an enormous political impact in support for figures like Trump and Marine Le Pen. And likewise for the dislocating effects of unfettered capital flows and the financialization of the economy. But there are two kinds of effects that has. One is the direct economic effect, job loss, wage stagnation. The other is an effect that is connected to a politics of identity construed more broadly than border policies, immigration. Identity in the sense of speaking to the expressive dimensions of politics. We talked about dignity and recognition. And it seems to me that people who lived in hollowed-out industrial towns suffered not only the wage stagnation or job loss, they also suffered the sense that the rest of the society, or those who governed it, didn't care about them as fellow citizens, didn't recognize them or respect them or care about their dignity.
Or even stigmatize them for being responsible for climate change.
And your language of stigma draws on the language of recognition, identity.
Definitely.
Judgment.
At the end of the day, it becomes identity. I agree.
Okay, so I want to connect this idea of stigma, of elites looking down, to the politics of identity in the sense of it's part of the politics of recognition and of belonging. And so what would be required to create the conditions for social democratic politics? It seems to me that we can't ignore the dimension, the politics of recognition, that is a kind of politics of identity, though not the one.
Not the one. It's not the same one. It's not the same one.
But it is. Yeah. And we need to articulate it. And in articulating it, we have to recognize and name the grievances
agree, but
and
it's
the
not the
resentments.
same one. But it's not the same one.
Okay. but it's still within that territory. It's not a purely economic. It's not a purely economic thing like
but
job loss.
there's no purely economic thing
Well,
because
okay.
it involves. It always involves. It's so multidimensional.
Yeah.
It's so the set of aspiration that we are talking about. We said being stigmatized for having your own car, for
Yes, that's it,
for having
exactly.
so typically, at the end it becomes identity, but it's a very different form of identity than the one stressing sort of ethno-racial origin and religion and color of skin, etc. So it's a very different kind of identity.
Yes,
but it is the left have to speak that kind of identity.